Now, because we're working with files, we're working on a PC, we're working with things that we want to upload to the internet, you need to be aware of the different types of file that can be used for video. And there are a whole lot more than we're going to talk about today, but what I'm going to mention are the ones that are important for you to be aware of. The first one is AVI, stands for Audio Video Interleave. This is what they call an uncompressed file format. So what that means is if we're working at a resolution of 1280 by 720, every frame of video is an image 1280 by 720, and they all get stacked one after another inside the video file effectively. So as you can imagine, these files get pretty big. They're not compressed in any way. They're just a collection of snapshots in time. However, by doing this, you're getting an absolute pristine copy in every frame. We then look at what's very common on a Windows machine, which is WMV. Stands for Windows Media View. And when I'm working with GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar, it actually captures in this Windows Media View, which is a highly compressed format. So it's taking what's on the screen, and what it's actually doing is it won't be creating lots and lots of frames of video at the moment because the screen's not changing. So we'll just have one image, and it will be effectively just logging every frame what's changed since the previous frame. And if nothing changes, it won't record any more information. So these files tend to be very, very small in comparison with an AVI file. But because they're compressed, you can lose a little bit in the quality. And also when you come to work with it in your video editor, because it's constantly having to figure out what the frame should be based on what's changed since previous frames, it can really put an overhead on your computer. The next one that you've probably come across is the MOV format. If you've got a Mac, this is pretty much the standard now on Macs, and this is QuickTime movie format. Again, it's a compressed format, but it's not as heavily compressed as the Windows Media View, so it tends to be a much better quality. And the majority of MOV files that you come across for internet video, you'll struggle, unless you've got a real high-end system, you'll struggle to see any quality difference between an MOV and an AVI file. The other type of file that you come across is FLV. This is flash video. When I first started working with online video, this was really the only way, other than having really expensive high-end dedicated streaming servers, this was the only way of getting video onto the internet. And you would have to have a flash video player. Then you would upload your FLV file and it would play through the online player. This was how YouTube started out. You can still upload FLV files to YouTube. It'll serve them very, very happily. The big downside with FLV, apart from the fact that it's an extra step in encoding, is that a lot of the Apple devices don't work with it. So if you're wanting to serve videos to customers who are working on iPads or iPhones, if you put an FLV video up there, they simply won't be able to see it. So I would say FLV's days are numbered. But like I say, it's important that you're aware of it. Finally, we have the MP4. And MP4 doesn't stand for anything more fancy than MPEG-4 container. Again, it's a compressed file format. But it's compressed in such a way that, again, can maintain quite high quality. All of my files that I upload to the internet are MP4. Everything that I upload to YouTube is MP4. Everything that goes up on my sales videos is MP4. Everything that you're seeing inside the membership area, they're all MP4 videos. And the great thing about it is you can put a link on your website to an MP4 video, even without putting any sort of video player on the site. And I would say something like 99% of all devices that could potentially view that site will be able to click on that link and will contain their own built-in player and be able to play it. So MP4 is very, very versatile. So again, a bit of information that's important to be aware of. You don't necessarily need to understand it in a lot of detail, but you really, really need to be aware of it. And you'll see later on when we get into the real production techniques why it's important. The file type of choice for internet video is the MP4 file. But specifically, it's an MP4 file encoded using something called the H.264 codec. Now, don't ask me how it got its name, H.264. Just simply memorize it. Be aware of it. Someone's talking about H.264, the chances are they're talking about an MP4 file. You sometimes hear of MOV files that are H.264 encoded. What that means, quite simply, is that it's an MP4 file which is contained inside a QuickTime MOV file. And they can be converted very, very quickly back out to a straight MP4 file that then becomes pretty much independent of the device. So as a high level, just to start introducing why all of these different formats are important, I thought I'll just walk you through a really 30,000 foot view of what the typical video creation workflow would be for a sales or marketing video. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm either going to create content or I'm going to more often capture content in an AVI format. So I work on this principle that I keep everything at the highest possible quality until the point where I say everything's ready and I want to render my video out. So everything is in AVI format as long as I can work with that where possible. So all of my editing stays in AVI format where possible. When I come to produce it, I'll produce it as an MOV. The reason that I produce it as an MOV is because I want to be able to open that with QuickTime. In fact, it's QuickTime Pro, but again, not important right now. But I want to be able to open it with QuickTime, and it prefers to work with an MOV format. So I'm using my video production software to create this MOV file for me. As I mentioned earlier, it's all 1280 by 720 all the way through. So I'm now producing a 1280 by 720 high definition MOV file. Now for a 10-minute video, that can be 6 or 7 gigabytes worth of video file. And even on a high-spec system like my own, I struggle to play that back smoothly. So we then need to come to the final step, which is encoding it to MP4 format for the web. So this is the point where we say, right, scale it down, compress it as much as possible, potentially reduce bandwidth, which we'll come on to in a moment, and get a nice compact file which I can then upload to the web. And to give you an example, recently the sales video that we looked at last week was a 1.7 gigabyte file. By the time I'd gone through all of this encoding process, I got to a 78 megabyte file, and you would struggle to tell any difference in quality just comparing it side by side on the PC. So the next thing we need to be aware of is video frame rates. Now the frame rate is going back to the old film cameras. So the film cameras literally took a number of still images every second. And these would then, when it was played back through a projector, these images, there's so many of them coming every second that it tricks the eyes into seeing fluid motion. So typically in the cinema we have 24 frames per second, and the eye will struggle to tell that you're looking at 24 individual frames of still images here. Particularly with a lot of the processing that goes on these days, it all looks very, very smooth. If you're looking at fast enough movement, you can sometimes notice the effect of frames per second. If you think of a lot of images of, for example, helicopters. If you look at a helicopter in real life, the blades appear to be a complete circle above the helicopter whilst it's flying. But very often when you see it on TV, the blades will appear to become stationary and then start turning the other way. And that's to do with the synchronization between how fast they're spinning and how many frames per second we're looking at. Then if we're in Europe, we have 25 frames per second, which is what we refer to as PAL, which is our standard TV format over here. And one of the reasons why it's 25 frames per second is because our electricity supply is 50 Hertz, which is 50 cycles a second. So 25 frames per second, it made it really easy to synchronize there. If we look in the US, in fact most of the world outside of Europe, we have the NTSC standard, which curiously is 29.97 frames per second. It's not quite 30. It's something like 30 times 1,000 divided by 1,001. I have no idea why they ended up with that figure, but just be aware of it. And again, a lot of video cameras, if they're working on NTSC standard, you might find that your video footage is at 29.97 frames per second. And you'll want to make sure that when you produce your video, you stay at that number of frames per second in order to keep all the audio in sync. We then come on to 30 frames per second, which is where we're looking at high definition video. And it should be quite obvious now, as I mentioned, the 25 frames per second for PAL standard, 30 frames per second works really nicely outside of Europe, where you're working with a 60 Hertz or 60 cycles per second electricity supply. As we get to bigger and bigger monitors, the effect of the frame rate becomes more apparent. So the video producers have found that they're having to work at higher frame rates so that the movement appears to still be smooth. So you'll see a lot of PAL high definition movies are now produced at 50 frames per second. And along those same lines, NTSC high definition is produced at 60 frames per second. Now, you do not need to learn all of these. You don't need to know what refers to what. Quite honestly, I've been doing this for several years now, and I still had to look up which was which. 25 frames per second is easy for me, it's PAL, because I work in a 25 frame per second world here. 30 frames per second, easy for me, because I work with a lot of HD video. The others, I've got to look them up. 30 frames per second, though, is my frame rate of choice. It's what I capture all of my videos in, it's what I produce them all in. The only reason that I wouldn't do this is if I have some problem with for example, smoothness of playback or file size or something like that. So 30 frames per second is the one to go for. Incidentally, GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar only captures at 15 frames per second. So we're looking at half this speed, which is why on some of the video frame playbacks, you'll notice that the animation is maybe not quite as smooth as we would like it. But certainly when I'm producing my sales videos and I use a lot more animation, I use a lot of effects with all of the letters flying in at different speeds and things like that. I want that animation to be as smooth as possible. So 30 frames per second is perfect for achieving that. Now, I've mentioned bandwidth a couple of times. Bandwidth is to do with, effectively, if you think of the internet coming into your computer and you think of it as a pipe, a water pipe. If you've got a really big pipe, so high bandwidth, you can get a huge amount of water through there. If you've got a tiny little pipe coming out the back of it, you're very limited to the amount of water that you could get through there. And everyone has different sizes of bandwidth, different amounts available that they can work with. So, for example, I have fiber optic broadband because I do a lot of video work. I've got 50 megabit per second, which is a lot. So I don't worry too much about the bandwidth that I have available. However, a lot of people, particularly in the US, funnily enough, are still working on maybe 1 or 2 meg broadband. So you can imagine if I'm producing something that appears to work really, really well at 50 meg, and somebody only using 1 meg tries to view it, they're potentially going to see that video stopping and starting whilst it's buffering and trying to catch up. So you need to be aware of bandwidth, but it affects the size of the file. So if I'm creating a bigger file, obviously it's going to take longer for somebody to download it. It also means it's going to take longer for somebody to stream it. It's going to take longer to actually buffer it up to give you that smooth playback that we're looking for. So what we need to do is we need to start fine-tuning our files. First thing we can do is we can potentially make a smaller dimension. One of the reasons that I'm using 710 by 400 for the membership area is because it gives a really good compromise between quality and the file size, hence the bandwidth that we need. We can also play with frame rate. If we're finding that all of our videos are just simply too big, we can drop that frame rate down, typically by half. I wouldn't recommend going lower than 15 frames per second, but you can do that. You drop it down to 15 frames per second, and if you think of when we were talking about the AVI files, if you're working at 30 frames per second, that's 30 images that are captured. As soon as you go to 15 frames per second, you've only got half the amount of images. So you're only working with half the amount of data, and when it's compressed, it's even less. But we can also fine-tune something called the data rate. And what this is when we're actually going to that final step of encoding our MP4 file, we can say how much bandwidth do we want to allow for. And when I first started out, I did all of my files at about 5 megabits. And that was fantastic. I mean, it was using 10% of what I had available. And my videos looked amazing. Until people started to view them and said, "It's no good, John, we can't work at this data rate." So I experimented. I started dropping it down and down and down and down. And I found that for the majority of videos that I produce, I can actually go down to 500 bits per second. So instead of 5 meg, we're looking at 500K, which is a significantly smaller bandwidth. And what this means is that for an almost indetectable change in quality, more people can have a smooth viewing experience of my videos. So that's it on the technical aspects. That's everything that we're going to talk about today, and I promise you we won't dwell on these in any future sessions. We'll just come to them when we need to use them. So hopefully after this session you'll really understand these technical foundations and we can really build on them.